What happens when the ex-royal couple who traded palaces for paparazzi tries to step back into the global spotlight, only to get shut down by an entire nation? That's exactly what Prince Harry and Meghan Markle are facing right now. Not in private, not behind the scenes, but in full view of the public. A plan that was supposed to be a warm, soft-power global tour in 2026 is quickly turning into a diplomatic disaster. And one name sits squarely at the center of the unfolding drama: Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because, according to reports that are now swirling across the Commonwealth and beyond, the Prime Minister didn't just ignore a behind-the-scenes request from the Sussexes for a private meeting. He flat-out snubbed them. And then came the quote that changed everything. "Don't come back. Hold on." This is the same couple that once received standing ovations in Sydney? The same Harry and Meghan who walked hand-in-hand along Bondi Beach to screaming fans just a few years ago? How did they go from welcomed royals to persona non grata? And more importantly, what happened behind closed doors that triggered such a bold rejection? You're about to find out. But first, ask yourself this. Can you imagine being told by the leader of a nation that your presence is not just unwanted, but politically inconvenient? Because that's the chilling undercurrent of what's playing out right now. And it's about much more than one rejected meeting. It's about reputation. It's about relevance. And it's about what happens when former royals try to rewrite the rules, only to learn that not every country is ready to play along. This isn't a simple scheduling issue. This isn't a delay. This isn't about logistics. This is a message, one that says, you've lost your shine. You've lost your leverage. And no, we're not interested in being your next redemption arc. Let's rewind for a moment. It started as whispers. Reports out of Montecito hinted that the Duke and Duchess of Sussex were planning something big for 2026. A Commonwealth charm offensive. A return to a country that once adored them. A splashy visit to coincide with the 250th anniversary of Australia's founding. A tour that, according to insiders, Meghan saw as a reset moment for their global image. And why Australia? Because it was once their shining stage. In 2018, during their royal tour, the Sussexes received thunderous applause across the continent. Crowds gathered in the thousands. Local papers splashed their photos across every front page. Meghan's speeches on women's empowerment were praised. Harry's Invictus Games received mainstream visibility like never before. So, of course, returning to that emotional high point made sense. Only this time, the political mood has shifted dramatically, because Australia's Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, is not interested in nostalgia. He's not interested in royal flattery. And he's certainly not interested in being dragged into a transatlantic media circus during a pivotal national anniversary year. You see, Albanese is a known Republican, politically, not just ideologically. He's publicly supported moves to sever Australia's symbolic ties with the British monarchy. And more than once, he's voiced his discomfort with the lingering colonial optics of royal tours and overseas titles. So when he reportedly received word that Harry and Meghan were interested in a private sit-down ahead of a potential 2026 visit, his reaction was not what they expected. According to sources close to Canberra, Albanese's team found the request inappropriate, tone-deaf, and an unnecessary distraction. One aide was reportedly so stunned, they thought it was a joke. Until they saw the briefing documents. Until they saw the names on the list. Until they saw that the Sussexes were quietly reaching out to multiple officials, hoping to secure a headline-grabbing moment in the Pacific. It was all too real. And for the Australian government, it was all too unwelcome. This wasn't just a denial. It was a strategic brush-off, one rooted in principle, politics, and, some say, personal irritation. Now, of course, nothing has been officially confirmed. The Sussexes haven't commented. The PM's office has stayed tight-lipped. But insiders are leaking. Quotes are emerging. And the press is piecing together a picture that isn't just inconvenient for Harry and Meghan, it's humiliating. Because the supposed reason for the private meeting? According to leaks, it was twofold. 1. To gauge how welcome they would be on a public tour. And 2. To explore collaborative initiatives on veterans issues, women's empowerment, and media transparency. On paper, it sounds noble. But to Albanese's team, it sounded suspiciously self-serving. Remember, this is not 2018 anymore. The world has changed. The monarchy has changed. And so have the Sussexes. They're no longer full-time working royals. They're Netflix producers, podcast dropouts, book authors, activists. They operate as a brand, not a branch of the crown. So what would a sit-down meeting with them achieve for Australia? Nothing. That was the conclusion reportedly reached by several top officials. Nothing, except drama, backlash, and the possibility of becoming a backdrop for another Sussex docuseries. And that's when the door slammed shut. An Albanese spokesperson reportedly delivered the message internally. We have no plans to meet with them. There's no public interest case. And frankly, don't come back. Harsh. Maybe. But politically calculated? Absolutely. And here's where things get even more complicated. The Sussexes, according to insiders, didn't expect this. They expected distance, perhaps, but not rejection, not silence, and certainly not a phrase like, "don't come back," making its way into the headlines. Because if that line sticks, if that sentiment gains traction, it could redefine the Sussexes' place on the global stage. Think about it. If Australia, one of the friendliest, most royal-obsessed Commonwealth nations of the last decade, is turning cold, who's next? Canada? Already lukewarm. South Africa? Already complicated. The Caribbean nations? Actively moving toward republicanism. Even the United Kingdom itself? Polls show declining interest in Meghan and Harry's public role, which leaves one question dangling in the air like a storm cloud over Montecito. Where do they go from here? Because without royal duties, without Hollywood hits, and now without international goodwill, the Sussexes may be facing their most uncomfortable reality yet. A world that simply isn't watching anymore. And that's the part no PR team, no Vogue cover, and no charity keynote can fix overnight. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if you asked for a meeting you were certain you'd get, only to be met with laughter? That's the exact scenario Prince Harry and Meghan Markle allegedly walked into when they initiated the first quiet steps of what was meant to be a triumphant return to the world stage. A trip to Australia, the crown jewel of their 2018 tour, was back on the vision board. But this time, there were no palace courtiers to organize the optics, no royal handlers smoothing out the diplomacy. It was all up to them and their private team. And that team, according to whispers from both Montecito and Canberra, made a bold move. They reached out to the Australian government, specifically to Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's office. Not for a grand public event, not yet, but for something subtler, more strategic, a private meeting. No cameras, just goodwill. The request wasn't outrageous on the surface. In fact, it was cloaked in polite language, diplomacy, and the usual buzzwords: veterans initiatives, women's empowerment, cultural collaboration. But behind the polished tone, it carried an unspoken message. We still matter, and we'd like your time. Only this time, they weren't dealing with royal advisors or Commonwealth planners eager to please the firm. They were dealing with elected officials, political realists, strategists. And within minutes of receiving the request, one of Albanese's aides reportedly rolled their eyes and muttered something that would soon spread like wildfire. "They can't do anything for my country." Now pause. Imagine that. You've been part of a global royal brand. You've walked in Jubilee parades, stood on palace balconies, addressed veterans under the Union Jack. You've dined with heads of state, ridden in royal motorcades. And now, a single advisor in Australia dismisses you as irrelevant. Not out of malice, but calculation. Because in their eyes, there's no upside. Let's rewind again. Because this is where the emotional whiplash really begins. It was late 2024 when the Sussexes team started putting out feelers. Quiet calls. Emails through intermediaries. The goal? Set the groundwork for a major 2026 initiative. Australia's founding anniversary would provide the perfect backdrop. A moment of historical significance, national reflection, and, ideally, a renewed connection between the country and a couple once adored. There was even a name floated internally, according to sources familiar with their planning, the Reconnect Tour. Except there was one flaw, a massive one. Nobody asked Australia if they wanted to reconnect. And when the request finally reached the upper tiers of Canberra, the answer wasn't just a no. It was a calculated no. One laced with subtext. One that revealed just how far the Sussexes had drifted from global diplomatic credibility. Why? Let's break it down. First, the political climate in Australia has shifted. Albanese is no monarchist. His party leans toward republicanism. And there's a growing movement across the country to cut ties with the British Crown entirely. So let's ask the obvious. Would a prime minister who's cautiously navigating those waters really risk alienating voters by cozying up to two ex-royals whose press coverage is anything but consistent? Second, the Sussexes are no longer seen as neutral figures. They're branded. And branding comes with baggage. Netflix deals, tell-all memoirs, Spotify flops, leaked letters, private jets, awkward documentaries, courtroom drama, media feuds, royal fallout. That's a lot of noise to bring to a high-stakes year like 2026, when Australia will already be juggling international attention, internal debates, and symbolic ceremonies. They don't need extra drama, least of all from a couple known for bringing the storm with them. Third, there's trust, or rather, the lack of it. Canberra remembers the Oprah interview. They remember how intimate conversations with the royal family ended up on global television. They remember the headlines, the tears, the accusations. So imagine being a head of state, or an elected leader, and getting a call asking, would you like a private meeting with Harry and Meghan? Would you be flattered? Or would you quietly wonder, will this show up on Netflix? That fear, according to diplomatic insiders, played a huge role in the rejection. And here's where the story takes a sharp, ironic turn. Because the Sussexes didn't just hope for a meeting, they expected it. Sources claim their team had already floated tentative dates, scheduled internal strategy sessions, even approached stylists and planners for the potential tour's lookbook. This wasn't a vague idea. It was a working plan. So when the word came back, cold, brief, and final, it hit harder than expected. No interest. No political value. Not worth the distraction. And worst of all, don't come back. The phrasing was reportedly not official. More a comment shared within senior circles, but it leaked fast. And once the press got wind of it, the damage was irreversible. Because that single phrase encapsulated the entire diplomatic disaster. It wasn't just a refusal. It was a reputation verdict. Now ask yourself, how does a couple recover from that? This wasn't tabloid drama. This wasn't a royal aide whispering off the record. This was a nation. One of the largest, most influential in the Commonwealth, sending a crystal-clear message. And the timing made it even worse. Because 2026 was supposed to be a milestone year. Not just for Australia, but for the Sussexes too. Their Netflix deal was up for renewal. Meghan's long-speculated lifestyle brand was due for launch. And Harry's hopes of expanding the Invictus Games into the Pacific were quietly gathering momentum. A visit to Australia could have tied all of it together. But that door? Now slammed. And here's the question no one seems to be asking. Why didn't anyone in their camp see this coming? Was it arrogance? Optimism? Or simply a fundamental misunderstanding of how far they've drifted from their former status? Because one thing is becoming painfully clear. The Sussexes might still be celebrities in America, but on the international stage, their brand is no longer bulletproof. It's fragile, conditional, and easily revoked. Just ask Anthony Albanese. He didn't tweet. He didn't make a speech. He just said nothing. And that silence? It was louder than any royal scandal. Meanwhile, back in Montecito, insiders say the mood shifted quickly. What started as excitement, we're going back to Australia, turned into awkward conference calls, PR damage control, rethinking the strategy, reevaluating their international influence. And behind the scenes, whispers grew louder. Could this snub trigger more dominoes to fall? Was Canada still open to a visit? Would New Zealand even take their call? Was South Africa, once a symbolic ally, now off limits too? Because if Australia could say don't come back, what's stopping others? More crucially, what if no one is waiting anymore? But just as the Sussexes began recalibrating their plans, a new problem emerged. One tied not to a politician, but to a deal. And it involved Harry's most sacred legacy project. One he never imagined could turn against him. What if silence isn't indifference, but strategy? That's exactly how Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese played it. No dramatic press conference. No formal statement. No outraged headlines directly from him. Just a void. And in that void, a message was delivered with surgical precision. It wasn't about theatrics. It was about calculation. Because if you thought Albanese simply ignored the Sussexes out of disinterest, think again. The cold shoulder was far more deliberate. A political move engineered to sidestep potential backlash, prevent unnecessary spectacle, and most of all, send a message without ever opening his mouth. Here's the thing. Albanese isn't new to controversy. He's been navigating a deeply divided cultural landscape in Australia for years. From the Republican debate to the Voice to Parliament referendum, he understands nuance, optics, timing, messaging. So when word reached his desk that Prince Harry and Meghan Markle wanted a private meeting, it wasn't just a scheduling issue. It was a political landmine, and he knew exactly how to disarm it, with silence sharp enough to wound. Let's take a closer look at how it all unfolded. The initial request, according to Canberra insiders, was not dramatic or demanding. It came through diplomatic channels with all the expected formalities, a softly worded expression of interest, hints about potential collaborations, an openness to dialogue. But that's exactly what made it so dangerous. Because while the language may have been polite, the implications weren't. If Albanese did take the meeting, it could be interpreted as an endorsement, not just of the individuals, but of their media brand, their scandals, their grievances with the monarchy. Worse, he risked becoming another unwitting character in their global narrative. And remember, Anthony Albanese is a Republican. That doesn't mean he's a revolutionary. But it does mean he supports the idea of Australia severing its constitutional ties to the British Crown. He's made no secret of this. He's even supported steps toward holding a referendum on the matter. Now ask yourself, would a man trying to steer his country toward independence from the monarchy really welcome two former royals looking to rehabilitate their image? That would be political suicide, and Albanese knew it. But rather than issue a confrontational no, he let his advisors do the heavy lifting. And that's where the cold shoulder strategy really began. According to sources inside the Prime Minister's office, the plan was simple. Acknowledge the request privately. Decline without fanfare. And if the story leaked, let the optics speak for themselves. And leak it did. Once the press caught wind of the refusal and the now infamous "don't come back" quote that reportedly came from a senior aide, the narrative spun itself. Albanese didn't have to do anything. The Sussexes, once again, found themselves on the receiving end of global headlines. But this time, they weren't the victims of royal snubs or tabloid cruelty. This time, it was an elected official from a modern democracy sending them a blunt political message. You're not the story anymore, and we're not your stage. And it stung. Because here's what most people don't realize. Harry and Meghan were banking on Australia. Not just for nostalgia, but for momentum. 2026 would have been the perfect moment for them to reclaim their Commonwealth relevance, to show they were still beloved, still influential, still connected to the people. But Albanese wasn't interested in helping them build that narrative, and he had his reasons. Let's go deeper. First, optics. Albanese was elected in 2022 on a platform of progress, reform, and independence. His government has made strides toward distancing Australia from its colonial past, not through aggression, but quiet steps. Cultural shifts, legal reviews, symbolic moves. Embracing the Sussexes, two figures still deeply entangled with the British monarchy, would have thrown all that off course. Second, timing. The planned Sussex visit, according to leaks, would have aligned with Australia's 250th founding anniversary. A year meant to reflect on history, embrace cultural inclusivity, and highlight Australia's unique identity. Now imagine that year being hijacked by tabloid coverage, paparazzi frenzy, and debates over Meghan's wardrobe. No serious leader wants that. And third, trust. Let's not sugarcoat it. The Albanese government had serious reservations about what a Sussex visit would really mean. Would it be a diplomatic exchange? Or a filmed segment for the next Netflix season? Would it be a respectful appearance at a veterans event? Or another viral moment that ends up on Meghan's podcast? These weren't wild guesses. They were grounded in precedent. Because the Sussexes had done it before. They turned royal family drama into docuseries. They turned family trauma into content. They blurred the lines between public service and personal branding. And Albanese's team wasn't about to gamble on being next. But let's pivot for a moment. Because there's one more layer here that no one's talking about. Anthony Albanese doesn't dislike Harry and Meghan. He doesn't have to. That's the brilliance of the cold shoulder strategy. It doesn't rely on malice or confrontation. It's calculated, professional, surgical. He doesn't have to insult them. He doesn't even have to name them. By doing nothing, he sends a message louder than any speech could ever achieve. And the message is this: Australia is moving on, and it doesn't need you to define its future. Now let's step into the Sussexes' shoes for a second. Imagine hearing all of this secondhand. No direct rejection. No opportunity to plead your case. Just silence, followed by a media storm, followed by speculation that you've been blacklisted from the very country you once adored. According to insiders in Montecito, the reaction was disbelief at first. Meghan was reportedly shocked. Harry felt disrespected. But was it really disrespect? Or was it just the natural consequence of overestimating your global pull? Because the truth is, Albanese didn't have to respond. He didn't owe them anything. And that's what made the rejection so cutting. It wasn't personal. It was policy. A policy of boundaries, of political clarity, of choosing national focus over international spectacle. And that, ironically, made it personal anyway. Because for a couple so accustomed to being the story, being left out of the narrative may have hurt even more than being criticized. And as whispers of other rejections begin to surface, from corporate sponsors, from charity events, even from Hollywood producers, the Australian cold shoulder is beginning to look less like an isolated event and more like a pattern. The Sussexes are finding that global influence is fragile. It needs constant tending, and it doesn't survive long without results. But just when you think they might be learning that lesson, another layer is exposed. Because while Harry and Meghan were reeling from Albanese's passive shutdown, a new threat was quietly brewing. One tied to legacy, to trust, to something far more personal than politics. And it involved Harry's sacred Invictus Games, the very thing he built, the one project that had remained untarnished. Until now, what happens when a highly coordinated royal comeback tour falls apart, before it's ever announced? That's the question now haunting Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's inner circle, as plans for a 2026 soft power reset in Australia implode spectacularly behind the scenes. Because what was meant to be a glorious return to the Commonwealth, complete with charity events, high-fashion photo ops, and Invictus legacy projects, has quietly morphed into one of the most embarrassing international snubs in recent royal-adjacent history. Let's not sugarcoat it. This was going to be their moment. A revival, a rebranding, a redemption arc played out on the sun-drenched shores of Sydney and the polished platforms of official state events. Harry and Meghan were poised to walk back into public favor, this time not as active royals, but as global changemakers who had broken free from the institution and now stood on their own. Only one problem: Australia never asked for them. In fact, as leaked memos, tabloid scoops, and insider whispers now confirm, key Australian institutions, from the federal government to state-level coordinators, were never formally consulted. And when they were, the response was, well, underwhelming. The tour that was supposed to dazzle the media and re-cement the Sussexes' global relevance was already falling apart. Quietly, fatally. Let's rewind and break down the anatomy of the trip that never was. It all started, ironically, with nostalgia. Back in 2018, during their first royal tour of Australia, Harry and Meghan were the golden couple of the monarchy. Crowds flocked to see them. Local news anchors fawned over their chemistry. Meghan's speeches about female empowerment captured hearts. Harry's commitment to wounded veterans earned him standing ovations. It was pure magic. So in 2024, as the Sussexes watched their US-based ventures stall, Spotify gone, Netflix on thin ice, Archewell sputtering, they turned their gaze back to the last place they'd been adored without question: Australia. The idea made perfect sense on paper. Australia was gearing up to celebrate its 250th anniversary in 2026. The country would be hosting major international commemorations, political summits, and cultural festivals. It was a PR goldmine, and Harry and Meghan wanted in. Sources close to their team say the vision was grand. A 10-day tour across Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane, focused on climate action, Indigenous rights, gender equality, and military service. Each stop would be carefully curated to reinforce their impact couple narrative, minus the baggage of the monarchy. Even fashion was part of the plan. Meghan had already begun informal conversations with stylists and designers in LA and London. The vibe? Understated elegance. Earth tones. California conscious meets Commonwealth chic. Private jet availability had been quietly scoped out. Invites to certain Australian charity figures were already being drafted. One insider even said the couple had been in touch with Vogue Australia to discuss a possible feature story timed with the trip. This wasn't a vague wish list. It was real. It was moving. And then it wasn't. Because the Sussexes made a critical mistake. They assumed that the popularity of 2018 still existed in 2026. That the same country that once wept and waved for them would do so again. Eagerly, instantly, unquestioningly. But time had passed. The world had changed. So had Australia. And most importantly, so had the Sussexes. Today, they're no longer the fresh, unspoiled faces of a modern monarchy. They are tabloid fixtures, Netflix narrators, memoirists, influencers. They carry a narrative now, and not all of it is positive. Australians had watched the Oprah interview. They'd seen the Netflix documentary. They'd read Spare, or at least the parts that trended. They knew about the accusations, the falling outs, the royal estrangement, the lawsuits, the Spotify flameout, the rumors, the drama, and many began to ask, quietly at first, then loudly, what, exactly, are they coming here for? Are they here for us? Or are we just the backdrop for their next publicity push? That question grew louder in certain political corners. In New South Wales, one state minister was reportedly concerned about hosting any Sussex-related event during the country's milestone year. It'll distract from the real purpose of 2026, the minister allegedly told colleagues. In Victoria, a charity partner previously involved with Harry's Invictus efforts expressed reservations about being seen as prop fodder for the couple's rebranding tour. Even within the military community, which had once warmly embraced Harry, there were now whispers of skepticism. One veterans advocate reportedly asked, "Is this about the cause or the cameras?" But the most fatal blow came from the top. Anthony Albanese and his advisors, as revealed in Chapter 2, weren't just indifferent. They were actively uninterested. There was no appetite to lend state-level credibility to a pair of ex-royals navigating a PR crisis, especially not during a year meant to celebrate Australia's independence and identity. A high-ranking Canberra official reportedly summed it up in a brutal soundbite. "We're not doing a royal tour without royals." And just like that, the entire framework began to collapse. Quietly, the Sussexes team began scaling back inquiries. Conversations with venue organizers stalled. Charity discussions slowed. One Australian media outlet that had been approached about exclusive coverage pulled out without explanation. Behind closed doors in Montecito, the mood shifted from excitement to confusion to panic. And then came the leak. A government insider, speaking anonymously to a major tabloid, confirmed that no official meetings were scheduled or even seriously considered. But that wasn't the headline that went viral. No. The one that lit up the internet was this: "Don't come back. Albanese government shuts down Sussex's proposed tour." The quote wasn't official. It wasn't confirmed. But it didn't need to be. The damage was done. Social media exploded. Twitter memes, TikTok breakdowns, YouTube reaction videos dissecting the coldest rejection in royal history. Even major news outlets picked it up, spinning it into a larger narrative of global rejection. And here's where things get painfully ironic. The Sussexes never even got the chance to be rejected in person. No letters were formally declined. No meetings were officially canceled. Because no one in Australia ever truly said yes to begin with. The trip, the tour, the revival, it was all happening in a vacuum. Planned with anticipation, executed with enthusiasm, and ultimately undone by the stark realization that no one was playing along. And yet, despite all this, one final twist remained. Because even as plans fell apart, Harry was still clinging to a single hope, a project he thought might survive the collapse. The Invictus Games, the one thing that had always been untouchable, apolitical, respected. But what Harry didn't know, what no one had yet dared to tell him, was that Invictus Australia was having second thoughts. That behind the scenes, even that legacy was on the brink of crisis. And when the first signs of that crack finally appeared, they did so with brutal clarity. Not in a press release, not in a headline, but in the form of a single, short message from a former military leader. One that read simply, "Invictus deserves better. What happens when the curtain slips? Just a little, and you get to hear what officials really think when the cameras are off." That's where this story turns from polite rejection to blistering honesty. Because what Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's staff reportedly said behind closed doors about Prince Harry and Meghan Markle wasn't just dismissive, it was devastating. And it wasn't meant for public ears. But it got out anyway. Let's start with the room where it happened. Canberra, late 2024. Albanese's executive briefing suite. The request for a private meeting with the Sussexes had just landed. No press, no formal event. Just a quiet conversation proposed by Meghan and Harry's team. On paper, it was diplomatic, respectful, carefully worded. But as soon as the aides read it, the silence in the room was deafening. According to an insider who leaked details to multiple outlets later, the first reaction came from a senior advisor, one who had worked with 3 different administrations and knew the political landscape inside out. She reportedly glanced up from the request email and muttered one damning sentence. "Are they serious?" No one answered, because the real answer was obvious. This wasn't a diplomatic gesture from respected royal envoys. This was a branding move from a couple fighting for relevance. And Albanese's staff knew it. One official, described by sources as a seasoned strategist with zero patience for celebrity politics, allegedly said, "This is an outreach. It's image rehab. And we're not here to help them film their next documentary." Ouch. But it didn't stop there. Another member of the team reportedly raised the stakes. If we let them in, what do we gain? What's the actual return? No one could answer, because there was no return, no diplomatic win, no policy benefit, just complications. And complications, as anyone in government knows, are poison. The room quickly aligned. No meeting, no engagement, no headlines. But the mood wasn't angry. It wasn't even tense. It was surgical. One aide reportedly said, "Let's keep it polite, quiet, no drama. If it leaks, fine, but we're not making this official." But another, younger staffer, one who'd worked previously in communications, spoke up with a darker warning. "If this gets out," they said, "they'll spin it. They'll say they were planning something noble, that we rejected service." That's when the phrase that became infamous allegedly entered the conversation. A different senior official, one familiar with Veterans Affairs and skeptical of Harry's motives, dropped this line. "They can't do anything for this country. We don't need a royal cosplay tour. Tell them not to come back." And that was it. The door slammed shut, not with fury, but with cold precision. But here's the twist. These weren't anti-royal radicals. They weren't Republicans looking for a fight. Most of the people in that room had, in fact, worked on or around the 2018 royal tour. Some had even met Harry and Meghan back when their public image was still shining. They remembered the crowds, the excitement, the hope, but they also remembered the aftermath, the chaos, the falling out, the explosive interviews, the constant drama. And now, in 2026, they saw no reason to invite it back. One particularly sharp remark reportedly came from an economic advisor who'd helped organize Australia's milestone anniversary planning. "This is a celebration of national identity, not a reboot for royal exiles." That quote, when leaked later to the press, hit like a sledgehammer. Because it reframed the entire story. It wasn't just a political decision, it was a cultural one. Australia, as these officials saw it, wasn't just rejecting Harry and Meghan. It was asserting its independence, drawing a line between the old world and the new. And the Sussexes? They were now relics of a system Australia was no longer interested in entertaining. Now pause. Think about what that feels like from Harry and Meghan's perspective. They'd built their image around service, around modernity, around progress. And here were the very people they thought would welcome that mission shutting the door. Not because of scandal, not because of tabloid smears, but because of optics, trust, timing. And that's where this story gets even more brutal. Because another comment leaked from that same meeting days later, one that summed up the core fear within the Prime Minister's office. It wasn't just that the Sussexes were controversial. It was that they were unpredictable. "You never know where the footage ends up," one official said. "They come for charity, and suddenly it's a Netflix montage." That was the nail in the coffin. Because the Australian government is famously conservative with its media image. Controlled, deliberate. It doesn't gamble with reputation. And Harry and Meghan? They become a gamble. Even charities in Australia began feeling the chill. Two nonprofits that had reportedly been approached by Sussex-linked advisors quietly backed away from any participation. One source said the leadership teams didn't want to be seen as pawns in a political tug-of-war. And the military? That's where the emotional impact hit hardest. Because Harry had always enjoyed deep respect among Australian veterans. His work with Invictus was admired. His military background, genuine, not ceremonial, earned him credibility. But even there, the ground was shifting. A senior figure in the Veterans Affairs community reportedly said, "We love Invictus. We support the mission, but we don't want to be used." The phrase that leaked was chilling. "We're not content for the comeback tour." That's when the alarm bells began ringing in Montecito. Because while Meghan was quietly pivoting to lifestyle ventures and fashion collaborations, Harry had poured his energy into Invictus. It was his crown jewel, his cause. The one thing that always stayed above the drama. And now, even that was at risk of being politicized by proximity. Insiders say Harry was blindsided when he learned how the Australian government perceived his request, not as a veteran offering support, but as a media figure seeking a PR moment. And that's where the real emotional weight comes in. For Harry, Invictus isn't branding. It's personal. It was born from trauma, from his own wounds, from watching fellow soldiers rebuild their lives. So to hear whispers that his motives were being questioned, that his legacy might be collateral damage in the wake of political skepticism, was a blow he didn't see coming. He reportedly told a friend, "I'm not trying to make a show. I just want to help." But it was too late. Because in politics, intention matters less than perception. And right now, the perception was clear. Harry and Meghan weren't just controversial. They were unpredictable, uncontainable, and untrustworthy in the eyes of governments who value discretion over drama. So what happens when doors close quietly, permanently? When the private comments leak and the public nods in silent agreement? You fade, you flounder, or you push harder. And that's what Meghan was allegedly preparing to do next. Because while the Australian officials were whispering, "Not welcome," Meghan was already crafting the next move. One that didn't involve governments, or military leaders, or royal nostalgia. One that would pull focus in an entirely different direction. And it began with 3 words whispered inside a Montecito meeting room. Go full Hollywood. He thought it was untouchable. For years, through every wave of controversy, every family rift, every headline, every awkward red carpet moment, Prince Harry had one anchor that kept his public image from drifting completely into chaos. The Invictus Games. His passion project. His personal legacy. The one cause no one could question. Until now. Because even that, it seems, is no longer immune. And what began as a noble effort to expand Invictus into Australia's 2026 commemorations has rapidly devolved into a quiet but devastating collapse behind the scenes. One that Harry never saw coming, and one that may mark the beginning of the end for his most meaningful endeavor. Let's start with the stakes. Harry wasn't just hoping to visit Australia in 2026 for the sake of nostalgia or headlines. He was, reportedly, laying the groundwork for something much bigger. A long-term partnership between Invictus and Australia's veteran rehabilitation programs. The plan, according to sources close to the foundation, was to expand outreach across the Asia-Pacific region, with Australia as a regional hub for events, training, and rehabilitation clinics. A bold move, a powerful legacy, and symbolically perfect, given that Sydney had once been one of the shining stops on the 2018 Royal Tour. Harry's speeches then were emotional, personal, powerful. Australia had embraced him, and Invictus? It was warmly welcomed. So it made sense, for Harry at least, that 2026 would be the year it all came full circle. Except this time, the embrace never came. Behind closed doors, the same skepticism that had sunk the Sussexes' proposed visit began infecting Invictus plans too. But this wasn't about politics. It was about optics, and the terrifying realization that even Invictus was no longer safe from controversy. Let's dig into the timeline. Back in early 2024, Harry's team had quietly begun talks with multiple Australian defence organisations and veteran charities. The pitch was straightforward. Let's bring an expanded version of Invictus to Australia. Let's do joint events. Let's collaborate. At first, responses were warm. Tentative, but warm. Invictus still held weight. Harry still had credibility among veterans. And the idea of linking the games to Australia's 250th founding anniversary seemed, at least on paper, like a win for all sides. But then came the complications. As news of the Sussexes' larger plans for an Australia reconnection tour began to leak, so did concern among potential Invictus partners. Suddenly, veteran organizers found themselves facing uncomfortable questions. Is this event going to be about veterans or the Sussexes? Will there be cameras? Netflix crews? Branded content? Are we going to end up in a montage for Archwell? One veteran advocacy group reportedly pulled out of exploratory talks altogether, citing mission alignment issues. Another raised red flags about perceived media entanglement. And that's when the unthinkable started to unfold. Invictus, the one project that had always risen above the drama, began being seen, however unfairly, as just another extension of the Sussex brand machine. The turning point? A leaked internal memo from an Australian veterans organization that had been in contact with the Sussexes team. The memo, obtained by a Sydney-based journalist, outlined the organization's reluctance to participate in any initiative that might become commercialized, politicized, or reframed for content monetization. The document wasn't meant for public eyes, but when it leaked, it went viral. And with it, a wave of questions erupted. Had Invictus changed? Was it still for the veterans? Or was it becoming a PR shield for a crumbling public image? To be clear, there is zero evidence that Harry intended to exploit Invictus. By all accounts, his commitment is real. His passion is deep. His involvement is hands-on. But in the world of high-stakes image management, perception often eclipses intention. And in this case, perception was quickly spiraling out of control. Australian commentators began questioning the motives behind the proposed expansion. Is this about Invictus? Or is it about salvaging Montecito? That headline ran in 3 major papers. One veteran spokesperson put it even more bluntly. Harry earned our respect because he walked the walk. But lately, it feels like he's packaging everything for the next headline. Oof, that line hit hard. And worse, it began to travel. Veterans in other countries started echoing the sentiment. Quietly, respectfully, but undeniably. And inside Harry's team, panic began to brew. They hadn't anticipated this. Not with Invictus. This was supposed to be the pure space, the untainted zone, the cause no one would dare criticize. And now, even that was bleeding into the narrative of rejection and mistrust. According to a source inside Archwell, Harry took it personally. This is what he cares about. More than the press. More than the drama. Invictus is where he finds peace. And when the feedback came in, it shook him. And perhaps the cruelest irony? Invictus wasn't failing. The events were still powerful. The athletes still inspired. The mission still sacred. But in the context of 2026 Australia, the association with the Sussex brand had become a liability, one potential partners couldn't ignore. So what did Harry do? He tried to fight back. Not publicly, not with a press release, but behind the scenes, he reportedly began calling key contacts himself. Veteran leaders, government advisors, charity board members. He wanted to reassure them. No cameras. No Netflix crew. No hidden agenda. Just Invictus. Just service. And some believed him. Some even supported him. But many had already made their decision. The risk wasn't worth it. Not now. Not with the Sussexes' names back in the headlines for all the wrong reasons. And then came the final blow. A former Australian general, once a vocal supporter of Invictus, made a statement at a Veterans Roundtable event in Brisbane. The quote was simple, and it spread like wildfire. Invictus deserves to be more than a brand rehab tour. That was it. That one line hit like a torpedo. Not because it was cruel, but because it was true. Even if Harry's intentions were pure, the surrounding noise had poisoned the well. Every project he touched was being viewed through the lens of strategy rather than service. And for Invictus, that was fatal. By mid-2025, the informal plans for an expanded Invictus Australia partnership had quietly been shelved. No announcement. No apology. No headline. Just gone. Like so many other Sussex initiatives before it. And the emotional cost? For Harry, insiders say it cut deeper than any tabloid headline ever could. Because this wasn't just another brand in the Montecito portfolio. This was the one thing that connected him to his past with pride. The one thing no one could take away. Until now. And while Harry was still reeling from the sting of Invictus being sidelined, a new threat was bubbling in the background. Not from Australia. Not from the military. But from the very institution he had tried to distance himself from. The British royal family. Because as the Sussexes' global credibility began to crumble, a quiet message was reportedly passed from Clarence House to a very specific diplomatic desk. And the message was short, unmistakable, and chilling. We won't intervene. What do you do when you've been publicly snubbed, privately rejected, and globally sidelined? If you're Prince Harry, you do something no one expected. You pick up the phone and call your father. That's right. Behind the Montecito gates, after the collapse of the Australian tour, the humiliation surrounding Invictus, and the political chill emanating from Canberra, Prince Harry reportedly made a bold, last-ditch move. He reached out to King Charles III, not through tabloids, not through lawyers, not even through his memoir, but directly. And what happened next wasn't just cold. It was calculated, because Charles didn't erupt. He didn't scold. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, nothing. And in that nothing, everything was said. Let's rewind to the moment it began. Following the unraveling of Harry and Meghan's 2026 tour dreams, Harry found himself increasingly isolated. His attempts to salvage Invictus had faltered. Meghan, meanwhile, was allegedly pivoting away from the diplomatic drama entirely and focusing on upcoming Hollywood ventures and brand alignments. But Harry wasn't ready to walk away. Because to him, this wasn't just about Australia. It was about dignity, legacy, a sense of identity slipping further and further out of his control. According to sources close to the Sussex camp, Harry believed a royal endorsement, just a quiet, subtle one, might be enough to soften Australia's resistance. Not a public appearance, not a press release, just a discreet, father-to-son appeal. A few words from the palace to Canberra, offering symbolic support for Invictus, or perhaps suggesting that Harry and Meghan's trip would still hold meaning for the Commonwealth, not as royals, but as respected figures. So he reached out, and that's where things took a sharp, frigid turn. Because King Charles, according to multiple insider reports, received the request and refused to touch it. No endorsement, no intervention, no favor. Instead, the king reportedly told aides, "It's not our place." On the surface, diplomatic neutrality, but behind the scenes, a devastating message. Because in royal speak, not our place doesn't just mean we won't get involved. It means you're not one of us. Let that sink in. Charles didn't just decline to help. He confirmed the Sussexes are no longer within the palace's diplomatic protection. It was, in many ways, the final uncoupling. Because for years, through the Oprah fallout, through Spare, through Spotify disasters and Netflix dramatics, there had always been whispers that Charles still hoped for reconciliation. That one day, the door might open again. But with this silent rejection, he didn't just close the door. He locked it. Now why would Charles do that? The answer lies in the quiet storm brewing within Buckingham Palace. Despite his outward calm, Charles has had to manage an institution that has suffered real damage from Harry and Meghan's revelations. Accusations of racism, leaks, fractures, public sympathy swings. And now, in 2026, with the monarchy still transitioning under his reign, the last thing Charles wants is to get dragged into another overseas mess, especially one that could look like a political endorsement of a couple whose every move is scrutinized through a media circus lens. One palace aide reportedly described the situation bluntly. Why would the king risk his reputation in Australia for people who've already weaponized his silence before? Ouch, that's the wound that hasn't healed. Because Charles hasn't forgotten what it felt like to watch his son sit across from Oprah Winfrey and imply, with devastating effect, that the royal institution failed to protect his family. He hasn't forgotten how Spare reduced decades of monarchy into emotionally charged anecdotes and perceived betrayals. And most of all, he hasn't forgotten how every attempt at private reconciliation seemed to mysteriously end up in the press. So when Harry asked for help with Australia, Charles did the only thing that would truly sever the dependency. He stepped back. He let his son stand alone. And make no mistake, that wasn't just a rejection. It was a message to the world. This is not our project. Even Queen Camilla, who has long remained publicly silent on Harry and Meghan, reportedly found the request laughable. An insider said she made one dry comment over breakfast when the topic came up. "Oh dear. They do like to be invited where they're not wanted." Sharp. Icy. Delivered with a smirk. But the most revealing moment came from Prince William. Because while Charles refused to comment, William reportedly had no such reservations behind the scenes. He didn't interfere, but he did make a statement, albeit indirectly. According to sources close to Kensington Palace, William made it known to mutual charity partners in Australia that his team had no plans to tour in 2026 and would not be overlapping or coordinating with any unofficial Commonwealth engagements. Translation: don't associate our work with theirs. And that subtle distancing sent another wave of chills through the Sussex camp, because it confirmed what many already suspected. The firm isn't just ignoring Harry and Meghan. It's actively moving on. And that leaves Harry in uncharted territory. Because for the first time in his post-royal life, he's learning what it means to be truly independent, without the soft influence of the crown behind him. And it hurts. One Montecito source reportedly said Harry was furious about his father's refusal to support him, especially on something as non-controversial as Invictus. But the palace's view is different. In their eyes, the Sussexes created a new life, a commercial one. And with that choice comes consequence. If you want freedom, they reason, you live with the fallout. You don't get to cherry-pick royal perks when your brand falters. And so, Charles remained silent. No endorsement, no intervention, no rescue, just silence. And that silence echoed louder than any denial ever could. Back in Montecito, Harry reportedly paced for hours after hearing the response. He'd hoped his father would at least call, speak, offer advice. But the phone stayed silent. No voice, no warmth, just distance. And here's where the irony hits hardest. Harry once said he left the royal family for freedom, for control, for peace. But now, stripped of both family influence and global credibility, he's discovering something far more brutal than royal restrictions: irrelevance. And as he sat with that realization, alone in a sprawling California mansion that once symbolized escape, a new storm was already brewing. Because while Harry was focused on royal silence and diplomatic rejection, Meghan was preparing to re-enter the spotlight on her terms. With fashion deals, with red carpet plans, with a new narrative. And as you'll soon discover, not everyone in Hollywood was excited to see her back. If the doors of diplomacy were slamming shut, then Meghan Markle was already looking for another entrance. Not through government halls or royal corridors, but through the red carpets of Los Angeles. Because while Prince Harry was still reeling from King Charles's chilling silence and the slow implosion of his Invictus hopes in Australia, Meghan was already pivoting. Away from the Commonwealth, away from quiet dignity, and straight into what she knew best: narrative control. And if that meant spinning the Australia debacle into a non-story, so be it. Because in Meghan's world, the story isn't what happened. It's what people think happened. So when word leaked that their private meeting request had been rejected, Meghan's PR instincts kicked in, fast, hard, and unapologetically. The new storyline? They never wanted to go in the first place. Let's unpack how the machine moved. Within 48 hours of the now infamous "Don't Come Back" quote making headlines, subtle but unmistakable shifts began appearing in media coverage. First, a source close to the Duchess told a friendly Hollywood outlet that the Australia rumors were completely exaggerated, that Harry and Meghan were laser-focused on their US-based charitable efforts and had no plans to return to the Commonwealth for the foreseeable future. A clear pivot, a quiet rewrite. Then came the anonymous briefings to fashion blogs and lifestyle magazines. The narrative? Meghan was booked and busy, developing partnerships with female-led luxury brands, preparing a capsule collection tied to sustainability, and possibly even eyeing a future directorial debut. Suddenly, Australia was no longer the center of her comeback. Hollywood was. And behind closed doors, her team had a name for it: the Malibu Reset. Because if Meghan couldn't be embraced as a royal changemaker abroad, she'd reinvent herself, again, as a bold, independent creative voice in California. And just like that, her focus shifted. No more scrambling over diplomatic snubs. No more chasing lost prestige. She was back in her element, controlling the brand. But not everyone bought it. Because behind the glossy headlines and choreographed photo leaks, something wasn't adding up. For months, Meghan had been quietly planting seeds about her desire to reconnect with the Commonwealth and reclaim the power of service across borders. Even her rumored lifestyle brand, still unnamed but trademarked under several vague shell companies, was originally pitched as having a global humanitarian footprint. And now, suddenly, all of that was gone. Australia forgotten? Commonwealth erased? Even the Sussexes' own team couldn't keep the story straight. In one media statement, an Archwell rep insisted that no formal approach had been made to the Australian government. But a leaked scheduling document, obtained by a British tabloid, told a different story. It listed tentative dates, city names, even a placeholder event titled Veteran Voices, a conversation with Prince Harry. So which was it? Was the tour never real? Or had it collapsed so badly they were now trying to pretend it never existed? The contradictions didn't go unnoticed. One royal commentator posted this biting tweet that quickly went viral. From Australia loves us to we were never going in under 48 hours. That's not a pivot. That's a panic spiral. And panic might not be far off. Because Meghan's PR machine, for all its polish, was now fighting a war on multiple fronts. The British press was openly mocking the failed tour. The Australian media had already moved on. And even American outlets were starting to ask uncomfortable questions. One U.S. magazine editor reportedly turned down a Meghan cover pitch, citing reader fatigue. Another entertainment executive allegedly said, "She keeps trying to launch something, but nothing sticks. The brand is confusing now." And that is the danger Meghan's facing. Because for all her PR savvy, the Meghan Markle brand is beginning to suffer from the one thing no public figure can afford: identity erosion. Is she a royal exile? A fashion icon? A political advocate? A director? A podcaster? Or all of them? Or none? In moments of crisis, clarity matters. And right now, Meghan's narrative is muddy at best. But that didn't stop her from trying to seize control. One insider claims that just days after the Australia story broke, Meghan's team began planning a strategic distraction. A series of stage photo ops, a podcast teaser, a private dinner with Hollywood power players, and most controversially, a leaked rumor that she was in early talks to star in or produce a film about female resilience in the face of global institutions. Too on the nose? Critics certainly thought so. One British columnist summed it up perfectly. Meghan doesn't just want to change the narrative. She wants to write, direct, star in, and distribute it through her own platform. And for a while, that had worked. But something was shifting now. The rejection from Australia wasn't just a logistical failure. It was symbolic. A reminder that influence isn't guaranteed. That not every stage wants to be used. And it triggered a ripple effect. Fashion houses reportedly began pulling back, worried about attaching their names to yet another rebrand. Netflix, still stinging from underwhelming metrics and a lack of follow-through, quietly removed Meghan's series concept from its internal development calendar. Spotify? Already gone. And with each retreat, the PR machine spun faster. More stories. More photos. More sources close to the Duchess. One particularly desperate pitch? A children's book re-release with updated illustrations, timed, awkwardly, around the Invictus media cycle. The goal was clear: drown out the silence with content. But here's the problem with that strategy. Silence lingers. And in that silence, questions start to echo. Why didn't Australia want them? Why didn't King Charles help? Why are even American producers growing hesitant? Why does every reinvention feel more rushed than the last? Meghan's team may be good at controlling the message, but the momentum? That's slipping, and her critics can smell it. But amidst all the spinning, there was one moment that shattered the curated calm. At a private Hollywood dinner, attended by a select group of stylists, influencers, and brand reps, Meghan was overheard expressing shock and offense at the way the Australian government had disrespected her husband. One guest, who leaked details anonymously, claimed she said, "They should have been honored. It's Harry. He gave them everything in 2018. And just like that, the mask slipped. Because behind the calm statements and curated media management, the emotion was still raw. They weren't over it. They weren't indifferent. They were angry, and beneath that anger, a dawning realization that no amount of PR spin could erase. The world might be done listening. But Meghan had one more card to play. If governments were closing doors, if Hollywood was hesitating, if even royal ties were severed, then there was only one avenue left: the American public. Because the only thing more powerful than elite support is populist attention. And Meghan was about to test whether she still had it. With a Vogue cover, a confessional interview, and a plan to turn sympathy back in her favor. But there was one problem. Another woman had just landed a major partnership in Australia. A royal woman. One without scandals, one still adored. And her name was Catherine.